Thank you, Moya, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to present a paper at the Food from Here conference. One of my first conference papers was actually here at Coventry University about 10 years ago, and it was part of an agri-food network meeting, and the paper was really trying to set out the rural development opportunities for short food supply chains in what are referred to as lagging rural regions. And that bit of personal context provides the jumping off point for today's paper, because what I want to do is to provide some reflections on the short food supply chain concept, but also think about and provide a little bit of a critique in terms of where we might want to go going forward. What I want to try and argue in the paper is that we need to extend the analysis of short food chain activities beyond the rural. In terms of structure, I'm very briefly going to recap some of the things that we know about short food supply chains to date. I then want to contextualise that discussion in relation to some recent food system shocks and relate that to some broader literature about transition management. And then I'm going to reflect on some work that we've been doing at the CCRI on food security, local food and short chain activities. So if we look at the short food supply chain concept from a kind of review perspective, the origins probably relate to some of the food miles ideas that Tim will be talking about. But essentially, the concept really came in the early 2000s, and there's a substantial body of European research at that time, which was interested in looking at opportunities for small agri-food producers to carve out niches in the food supply chain, to develop high quality specialty products as part of what I was going to say Brian and Moya, but Ilbury and Nevesey referred to as the quality turn. So it was all about retaining added value, about enabling a more direct connection between producer and consumer. And there are three types of short food supply chain which are now fairly well known. Face-to-face supply chains, so things like farmers markets, what are called spatially proximate, so something like a farm shop that some of you would have been visiting yesterday, and then these spatially extended examples, things like labels, things like selling through the internet and so forth. And a lot of this stuff is caught up with a broader kind of attempt to protect rural places from neoliberalisation, from very conventional supply chains, etc. And in very simple terms then, we're talking about the rural local equals short food supply chains, and those initiatives have benefited from various CAP reforms, which I won't go into in any detail, and a broader sense of promoting a sense of endogenous rural development. And there's a particularly strong notion that short food supply chains represent what might be termed a new agrarian model for rural development. And this was captured particularly in a very important project, a Framework 5 project called the Impact Project. And some of the papers from that work are listed there. And the basic idea was that fixing products to places engenders greater endogenous rural development. It provides opportunities for farmers. It re-centres farmers in debates about rural development. And in a more critical paper, David Goodman comments that the ability of quality products to secure premium prices and so generate excess profits is a central plank of this market-led value-added model. That's essentially what we're talking about. And what I want to do in the paper is to argue that first of all, we must not discredit the importance of that argument, and that's not what I'm trying to do. But what I want to try and do is to extend the short food supply chain focus beyond the rural local arena. That's basically what I'm trying to do, and move it beyond the kind of market-led model. So some of this has already been covered, but I think it's important to contextualise that in the context of what I'm describing as food system shocks. So we all have heard about these things, the horse meat scandal, food price inflation, etc. And what I've been arguing in a paper with James Kerwin as part of a special issue is that food security has now become what we might think of as a food policy master frame. It dominates discussion, it's central to discussions. And in these processes, in these times of shock, there's an opportunity to redefine and revalue the short food supply chains concept, and possibly to ask the question, is the value-added model too narrow a model to be thinking of? And essentially I'm going to argue that that is the case. And perhaps what we need to think about doing is to think about multiple transition pathways rather than one value-added transition pathway. To help me to do that, I'm going to draw on a little bit of transition management literature. So bear with me as I bore you with a diagram. There you go. So this diagram is actually a simplified version of a diagram which comes from an important paper by Frank Giels and Johann Schott in a journal called Research Policy. And what this diagram is trying to do is to position short food chains as what we might describe as niche innovations or bottom-up innovations. So the diagram refers to three basic levels. You have what are termed the landscape pressures, or they term them the exogenous context, if you want to use big words. But essentially these are things like food security pressures, climate change pressures, and so forth, that are pushing down on the mainstream system, which is the mainstream food system in this case, but also pushing down, but providing opportunities for those bottom-up niche innovations that are at the bottom there. And one of the interesting things about this perspective is the potential to think about relationships between these different levels. So what might be the relationship between short food supply chains and mainstream food governance? And that's an interesting thing to think about. So if we think about this broad framing, where does food supply chains and local food networks more broadly fit in this new time of food system shock? I'm being a little bit dramatic, so apologies for that, but there you go. So, in a recent paper with my colleague James Kerwin, we tried to look at the UK food security discourse. In very simple terms, we're asking ourselves, where do local food networks, short food supply chains, alternative food networks, all these kind of things that certainly we spend most of our time researching, fit in this emerging official UK food security debate? And the news is not very good, I'm afraid, because what we found is that essentially these activities are sidelined. They're pushed to the side in debates about food security. The support for local food networks, for short food supply chains, is, I would say, and we've argued in the paper, rhetorical. Why is that? Well, because we're talking about relatively small quantities of food. We struggled, when we were putting the paper together, to find any sector-level data on local food and what it contributes. There's some piecemeal information, but it's very difficult to get an overall picture, and that's why the stuff Moye's been doing is so useful in many respects. Now, of course, it would be ridiculous to argue that local food networks can make a significant contribution to national and global food security. That would be a very silly argument indeed. But what we've tried to argue in the paper is that we need to rethink how we frame local food networks and indeed food security. But the official perspective is that really local food networks and short food supply chains are essentially very much a niche and will remain that way. And our argument really is that dismissive view is potentially missing some important opportunities. And what we try to do in the paper is to refocus more on micro level and community needs when we start to talk about food security, and therefore when we start to talk about what some of these networks might be able to offer. So the entry point then is to suggest that essentially these market-orientated short food supply chain models that I was describing in the earlier part of the review might be framed as kind of what Goodman et al. Refer to as first-generation food relocalization. So in other words, there is a diverse mix of community-orientated, often volunteer-based schemes, community allotments, food co-ops, buying groups, and we need to recognise that more diverse mix as part of our story. So hopefully I'm doing okay for time. I've got no idea, but I shall crack on. What I now want to talk about and draw in, okay, that's fine, where, is some recent work that we've been doing on the local food programme, which is one of two very significant national level programmes that have been funding some of these activities in the UK. And we're currently carrying out the evaluation. It's been led by James Kerwin, and myself and Brian Ilbery are working on it as well, of this programme. It's a £60 million programme. It was launched in 2007, and it distributes funds to more than 500 food-related projects. You can have small grants, you can also have quite substantial grants, as you can see there. The aim of the programme is to make locally grown food accessible and affordable to local communities. And as I say, we're carrying out the evaluation at the moment. Here's a little graph which just shows you the distribution of activities in terms of, thanks very much, in terms of project types. This is the number funded. So there was 507 projects funded. You've got 17 different types of activity. We've conflated those categories down to think about enterprise type activities, so things like box schemes, farmers markets, that sort of thing, those first generation short food supply chains. Then a lot of community growing type initiatives, allotments, city farms, community food growing, as well as an education and learning element. Community food growing is particularly strong in terms of the number of projects funded. Some very general observations that are emerging from this ongoing evaluation. The first is that the local food programme is supporting community-based projects. It's arguably mobilising the short food supply chain concept, although it doesn't realise it, at a community scale in slightly different ways. It may not necessarily be producer to consumer, it might be community grower to consumer, but there's still a mobilisation of the short food supply chain concept going on. It's extending the model beyond that rural local idea. Crucially, what we've argued is that many of these local projects are actually not about food at all. Food is a pretext. It's a vector for social agency. It allows community cohesion and all these other important things to go on. And another significant finding is that many of these local food projects are actually urban and peri-urban rather than rural. So I've rabbited on, so I think I'm running out of time, which is always a shame. But what I do want to do is to introduce this concept, which I think is very interesting, and it's this idea of civic food networks. It's emerged from a paper that I've been reading recently by Henk Renting and colleagues. And it's a way to try and, I think, position some of what I've been talking about and where it's going on. And one of the key things is that consumers play an active role in some of this stuff. These civic food networks complement, but they do not replace, short food supply chains. So we're talking here about consumer co-ops, solidarity buying groups, collective urban gardening, that sort of thing. A couple of key arguments in the paper. One is that civil society as a governance mechanism is increasing in significance when we think about agri-food networks. And secondly, that these networks indicate a changing relationship between urban-rural relations. Often, cities are the starting point, not the end point. So how long have I got? 1 minute. Brilliant. 3 slides. It's never going to happen. So I was going to talk about this project, which is an EU project called Superb Food. I'm not going to have much time on it, but I think another speaker will pick it up anyway. But what we're trying to do in that project is to situate short food chain activities in the context of city regions to again unpack the dynamics between the rural and the urban. And there's a very nice map of our 7 city regions. I can talk about that later if you want. But by way of conclusion then, what I've tried to argue is to get us to think beyond short food supply chains and the rural local. We've seen how official food security discourse is sidelining these activities. So what we need to do is to reassess and reevaluate the form that these networks take and crucially where they take place. It's peri-urban and urban contexts as much as rural, and we're possibly talking about proactive forms of place-based governance, so new interesting relationships emerging between civic, private and market corporations. So I hope that's been some use. Thank you very much for your time, and yes, that's that. All right then.